Okay, so to get set up for plaster, you want to make sure that you put lots of newspaper down and cover whatever surface you're working with. You'll want to cut the plaster on top of the newspaper and make sure that you have everything spread out. So I'm going to spread out lots of newspaper. I have my shoe ready to go. I gave you anywhere from 5 to 6 pieces of plaster. You probably won't need all of it, but I wanted to make sure that you had enough. And then you'll also need scissors. Now, plaster is not great for scissors, so don't let it dry like I did on these. And clean the scissors right after you use them today, okay? All right, the other thing you'll need is a bowl of water, and you'll want it to be at least 1 inch or 1.5 inches deep. A Gladware container works great, or a bowl that you're not going to eat out of. It's not toxic. So as long as you clean it with hot water and soap, you should be totally fine. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to cut your plaster strips in anywhere from 1 to 2 inch little pieces like that. And I like to cut quite a few
before I get started. That way I don't have to pick up my scissors when my hands are all wet later.
Okay, so now I have a nice pile that I can pull from. You don't want to get the plaster wet until you're ready to use it. So I'm going to put the bigger pieces that I haven't cut aside. You might save a couple, not cut all of it, and save a few just in case you need some different shapes towards the end. So you want to make sure that you don't get these plaster strips wet. So if you look at them closely, you'll notice that they have a lot of holes in them. You'll want to try to smooth these out onto your sculpture so that the holes disappear. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to dip it into water, and then I'm going to take off the extra water. Now, once you start this, you'll want to make sure that you have some paper towels or something around so that you can dry your hands off every once in a while. When you get the plaster wet, you soak it all the way down into the water, pull it up, and then take 2 fingers like this and kind of smooth it out. And you'll start to notice that the holes kind of disappear. Now you want to try to keep it nice and flat. Think of it like a piece of duct tape. If it folds over on itself, it starts to get really hard to work with. Then I'm going to just choose a random spot on my sculpture and lay it down flat and then smooth it out. Do you see how the holes are disappearing? I'm going to wrap it around the bottom and I'm going to smooth out all of the edges so it gets nice and flat. This is very similar to paper mache, but plaster is a lot harder when it dries. Now, if you don't smooth it out all the way and it dries, there's no way to go back and re-smooth it. So you want to make sure that you're working carefully. You also want to make sure that you're putting your plaster strips in different directions and overlapping them. So for example, this one is in this direction, so I'll want to slightly overlap my next one over that and then smooth it out. These are not large sculptures, so they don't take a long time, but you'll want to make sure you have at least half an hour, 45 minutes. You'll want to do the whole shoe in one sitting. So make sure when you start, you have enough time to finish the whole thing.
So get completely soaked, submerge the strip into water, lay it down nice and flat, and then wrap it around your edges and work on smoothing out. If you don't smooth out all the holes, it'll just have a lot of texture to it. So it's not the end of the world, but it's harder to paint a design on top when it's really bumpy. So rounded edges like this, you want to make sure that you're covering all of the tape, wrapping it around the edges. And you'll want to try to avoid having it fold over a lot. You can always cut these little pieces smaller for smaller sections. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and speed this up. One thing I want you to notice while I work is that I also am going to wrap it over the top and the bottom as well.
you feel like you're done, while it's still wet, you want to continue to smooth out the plaster as much as possible. And then you'll want to try to catch anywhere where there's a tiny bit of the cup or any piece of tape showing. And you can make little patches like this, little square patches, to kind of fill in smaller spaces if you don't want to add more bulk to the plaster.
Notice how I wrapped my plaster around the top edge, and then I smoothed it out on the inside as well. If you have extra plaster, you can plaster the inside of the cup. What's nice about this sculpture is you can use it as like a pencil holder at the end because it's functional as well. And so you can plaster the inside, but I want to make sure you do the outside before you do that. So if you look here, you can see these little patches that I haven't completed. So I'm using just smaller pieces of plaster to patch those up. And I'm smoothing any little hole that I see. Smoothing the top edge. The smoother the better because it's a lot easier to paint when it's smoothed out. The bottom you don't have to plaster unless you want to, unless you have extra. Some people like it if it's totally finished, so you're welcome to do the bottom if you have extra as well. So see where there's a little tape there? You want to double check. Remember, when it dries, you can't add more. It has to be all in one sitting. So you'll want to make sure when you're ready to let it dry that you are 100% sure that you have filled in all of the gaps and you've got it as smooth as you can. So I'm going to leave my bottom open. I'm going to leave the inside open so I don't waste plaster. But if you have extra, you're welcome to do the inside and the bottom of your sculpture.
Okay, so for cleanup, you want to make sure that you clean your scissors. You actually don't want to put plaster down the sink. So I'm going to get the plaster off my hands in the little bucket that I've used. I have paper towels laying around, so I'm going to dry my hands off and I'm going to dump this outside in the grass. There's not a ton of plaster in there, but you don't want plaster to go down the sink. If a little bit happens to go down the sink, it's not a huge deal, but let's not get your family mad at me, okay? So this I can just dump outside in the grass or on the sidewalk or wherever. And my sculpture, I can leave on a piece of newspaper and it'll be dry tomorrow. So it just takes about a day to dry. So you want to leave this out to dry. So clean off your scissors, clean off your hands in the water that already has plaster in it and throw it outside. Not down the sink. And then carefully fold your newspaper so that you don't get any of that plaster dust on anything else. Fold your newspaper and throw it away. And clean any surface with water and paper towels. Any extra plaster you can keep or you can send back to me if it's not wet when you return supplies. It's totally up to you. So that is your plaster sneaker.